Do you know the term NIMBY? You don't know the term NIMBY? One person amongst you. It's an acronym that stands for Not in My Backyard. Now that I said that, you probably remember that, don't you? NIMBY. There's another one. NIM. Not in my neighborhood. There are neighborhoods all over the city that are comprised of ethnic groups and different social lifestyles. And those neighborhoods are sometimes accepting of folks who come to visit and sometimes not. Some people don't want certain kinds of business or certain kinds of neighbors or certain kinds of schools or churches or mosques or synagogues being built in their neighborhood. Recently, in New York, a mosque was going to be built several blocks from the 9/11 from the Twin Towers site. And there was a lot of rhetoric about that going back and forth, that people wanted to stop that. Probably not for the right reasons. Nevertheless, as I understand, that project went forward. Is that not true? Maybe we should look it up when we get home. But I think the project went forward because they kept going through all the legal hurdles. But certainly there were people who did not want that mosque to be built in that neighborhood. Not in my neighborhood. Not in the backyard of the place in which those explosions and the destruction of those towers took place. It was an affront to the people of New York, and they didn't want it there. Sometimes there's valid reasons for forcing some people to make their existence or their home or their place outside of our own camp, outside of our neighborhood, somewhere else. Just go there, we don't want you here. And these readings today, one from the Leviticus and one from the Gospel, provide us with an example of that. And they are the characters of lepers. Leprosy was prevalent and was a terrible disease in the world at the time in which Jesus had his ministry. And leprosy was a sign to the people who encountered a leper that God had brought illness upon them, that their family had sinned, or they had sinned, or their mothers or fathers had sinned, and so the sins of the generations ahead of them are visited on those that come thereafter. And leprosy was a terrible sign of that people believed. And leprosy, or whatever kind of disease might have happened, was considered entirely very contagious, and indeed some forms are. So the one that's afflicted with the disease is told that he has to live outside of town, outside of the camp. If for some reason they had to wander through the village or town, someone had to walk ahead of them and park people aside and shout out, "Unclean! Unclean! Stand aside!" And immediately people would know a leper or lepers are coming through. And so those folks that were lepers, and this is symbolic language for us today, were those that were told they had to live outside of the community. They didn't belong. They didn't belong there, so they were outcasts. So the word outcast may sound a bit strong for us, but indeed there are outcasts in the world. There are outcasts in our own community. There are people in our community who feel outcast for one reason or another. There are unspoken attitudes in our neighborhoods and in our backyards and in our communities that keep people out and keep other people in. And it happens most often to those cast out, or feel outcast, or feel uninvited, or feel they don't belong. It happens most often, and is felt that way, to someone who's in most greatest need to be in the community. Jesus created a community of followers, of disciples. He didn't go about the world with just 1 or 2 or 3. He went with 12 disciples, as we know, and communities followed him wherever he went. And the word spread by those disciples and that community that he gathered. And in some cases, I often have said that maybe if we were not called Christians, we could have been called the Communitarians. The Communitarians of Jesus Christ, because we're brought together as a body of teachers, of healers, of lovers, of forgivers, of disciples of Jesus who are engaged in the business of being in community. Some people have often told me, I don't need to go to church because I can pray to God at home. And my response always is, you cannot be a Christian unless you're in community. You cannot be a Christian by yourself unless you're in community with other Christians. Because we need the encouragement of others, we need the inspiration of others, we need the support of others, and we need to be present to give support to others in their times of need when they may feel outcast or on the outside edge. Hence, we need to live and be engaged in the life of community. We need to be Christians in community. And Jesus exemplified that in what happened in this gospel story today. A leper came to Jesus and kneeling down begged him and said, "Now why did that leper come to Jesus?" Ever wonder that? Perhaps the leper from a distance had heard the teachings of Jesus or heard what members of Jesus' community had been saying about him and what he had been teaching. And he thought, this man will not cast me out. This man will hear me. This man will welcome me. And so he goes to Jesus and begs him and says, if you wish, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretches out his hand, touches him, and says to him, I do will that you be clean. And he was. And the leper became a part of the community, of the communitarians, of the disciples, even though Jesus said, don't tell anyone about it until you go and go through purification at the temple. Nevertheless, this leper immediately became a part of Jesus' community because Jesus healed the sense of being outcast, the sense of being pushed to the outside edge, the sense of not being able to live in the neighborhood of the precincts of the temple or in the city or in any other neighborhood in that land because he was a leper. He immediately became, by the healing of Jesus, a member of the community. And he went out and did what members of the community of Jesus do. Teach and proclaim the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And the good news was that he was healed. Healed from being an outcast. Now, it's one thing to keep dangerous people on the outside edge and away from the camp. Sometimes people must be imprisoned because they're dangerous. They threaten the security of the community. But most people who are on the outside edge of the community, pushed to the side or feel unwelcome, are not really dangerous at all. They may annoy us or make us uneasy. They may make us angry. They may disagree with us. They may fight with us. They may argue with us. They may think their way's better than ours, and back and forth we go. But we need not push each other out. It's unsettling and uncomfortable when we're in those kinds of positions. But how do they really, in reality, threaten our safety in the bosom of the Church of Jesus Christ? In the bosom of the community of the communitarians who welcome all in to be part of our community. Now, there's probably not any member of us here today who is not at least once, twice, 3 times, or many times, too many times to number in our lives, where we felt on the outside edge of something, where we felt like we didn't belong, or we felt like we weren't wanted, and couldn't be part of the team, or couldn't be part of the church, or didn't belong there. Most vivid for me, remember when you were in elementary school and everybody lined up against a fence, and there were 2 team captains and they picked who was going to be on their team? And everybody stood against the fence and kept saying, please don't let me be the last one picked. Anybody experience that? Don't let me be the last one picked because it means I'm the most unwanted. I never was the last one picked. But I wasn't the first one picked. What did Jesus say about those who were lined up and on the outside edge? The last will be first. And the first just may be the last. So there's not one of us who's ever not experienced being on the outside edge. Being in a place of discomfort where we felt we were not wanted. Or in a place where we found ourselves thinking that others didn't belong. But we know how Jesus responded to that in this gospel message. He welcomed and made the unwanted person clean and showed the community that his disease was not a cause for sin. He welcomed him into the community of righteousness that he was forming with those 12 disciples and that community of followers that followed him all around the Galilee and subsequently became our ancestors in faith who taught the good news of Jesus Christ and the way in which he taught us to live in this world. That no one is outcast and everyone belongs and all are welcome. And so we are a community of communitarians. We are a community of Christians who gather together. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there our Lord is present. And it should not be a surprise to us that Jesus was also an outcast. They wanted to get rid of him. They didn't want him preaching or teaching. The temple authorities, we hear those stories often about how they plotted to find a way to get rid of Jesus. They called him a rabble-rouser. They called him a person who incited riot. He didn't belong entirely to the community that he grew up in. He belonged to a community of heaven, a community that God sent him into the world to create. And that community welcomes the outcast, welcomes those who reside on the outside edge, because the neighborhood of the church is open to all. There's no NIMBYs here. There's no NIMS here. We're all members of that community. Paul, the writer of the reading we had, the second reading today, proclaimed the gospel to the Jews and Greeks alike. And that was part of his compassion for the community that was growing. And yet we know that even Paul and Peter argued and sometimes felt that neither one belonged in that community. And yet they reconciled and they brought about the growth and teaching and newness of a new way of understanding what life ought to be like in the world. And that God had forgiven sin through his Son, Jesus Christ. And there have been others like that just as well, that have been open to what Jesus taught and welcomed all. Francis of Assisi kissed a man who was a leper at the risk of his own life. Women and men down through the ages have welcomed in this country runaway slaves into their homes. Slaves who, in the early part of this history of this country, did not belong anywhere but to their master. And yet, when they were freed, they became part of the community. And even as slaves, many were Christians and looked to the day that they would find freedom in Jesus Christ and freedom to live in the community of the world. I started this morning or afternoon by saying something about a mosque being built near the Twin Towers site. Shortly after that terrible event took place in the history of this country, and in the world indeed, a group of Catholic high school girls from a local high school in New York walked from their school to a school for Muslim girls. And they all wore headscarves and stood outside of that school and embraced every girl who entered in to go to school that day. The neighborhood of Jesus Christ is ever expanding. It welcomes all in, and there will never be any outcasts. Remember your own experience whenever you felt like an outcast. Thank God for drawing you back into the circle of belonging and care. And pray for the insight to understand why you hold some people at a distance, or they may hold you at a distance, and pray for reconciliation. Pray that they will join you in the community of the Communitarians of Jesus Christ, and ask God for the courage to open your heart to them, and them to open their heart to you. In His most holy name, Amen.